Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Paul Golin. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And today we're going to be talking about school vouchers, the assault on public education. And this is an initiative of Jews for a Secular Democracy, which is SHJ's pluralistic initiative, bringing Jewish voices to issues around church-state separation. And we are absolutely going to get into how school vouchers are a church-state separation issue. This program is co-sponsored by a bunch of organizations that we're so glad were willing to co-sponsor this, and especially because we love what these organizations do, and I'm going to very briefly list them. Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Congregation Beth Adam of Loveland, Ohio, Florida National Organization for Women, Or Adam Congregation for Humanistic Judaism in Phoenix, Temple Israel Orlando, Folkshul Philadelphia, National Council of Jewish Women Florida sections, Congregation Beth Adam South Florida, Jewish Women's Foundation of Greater Pittsburgh, Society for Humanistic Judaism, and the Secular Humanistic Jewish Circle. Today, I am joined by an amazing panel of three folks. I want to briefly read you their bios. Beth Lewis is Executive Director of Save Our Schools Arizona. Beth is a mom, public education advocate, and K-12 policy expert who fights for a fully and equitably funded school for every Arizona child. As director of Save Our Schools Arizona, Beth works to bring parents, educators, elected officials, business leaders, and community members together in support of Arizona's public schools, which strengthen our communities and our great state. Beth has taught elementary and middle school in Arizona for 12 years and has been named a Rodell Exemplary Teacher and Temple Diablos Teacher of the Year finalist. Mark Davis is a member of Ohio's Congregation Beth Adam Social Action Committee's Separation of Church and State team. Mark is a founding member and president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation Cincinnati Metro chapter, and he is a supporting member of Americans for Separation of Church and State, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the Student Secular Alliance, and the American Humanist Association. Mark has a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling from the University of Cincinnati and hospital administration from Xavier University. He was the director of addictions disorders treatment programs for over 43 years and provided numerous education programs to healthcare and other professionals. And finally, Nick Nartowicz is lead policy counsel at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Nick joined Americans United in 2017. As lead policy counsel, Nick tracks and analyzes legislation that would affect church-state separation and religious liberty. He serves as an expert on church-state separation law and policy to state and federal legislators and staff, advocates, media, and the public. He drafts letters to legislators and works with allies to defeat bills that would undermine religious freedom. He joined AU after working for 2 years for Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser in the Office of Federal and Regional Affairs. As policy counsel, he works with Congress and federal agencies to advocate D.C.'s priorities in judiciary, legal, public safety, LGBTQ, and technology issues. He also helped lead DC's successful 2016 statehood referendum. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with Nick to lead us off. In essence, what are school vouchers, and how do you believe school voucher programs infringe on First Amendment protections concerning the separation of church and state?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be talking to all of you. So private school vouchers can take many forms, but essentially they're any program that's designed to fund private schools with public dollars. The most common forms of private school vouchers that we see are traditional vouchers, education savings accounts, and tuition tax credits. So I'm going to run through what each of those looks like in practice. So first is a traditional voucher, and that's where taxpayer dollars go directly from the public treasury to a private school to pay a student's tuition. In that case, it's really easy to see that money is being diverted directly to private schools. Second are education savings accounts, which have become much more popular in recent years. There, the government deposits money into a separate account that parents can use to pay for education expenses. Sometimes those expenses are limited to just things like tuition and books and uniforms, but more often we're seeing that includes a really wide variety of things like online curricula, resources, tools, things like that. Sometimes it's, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, access to really anything that you want as you can justify it as an educational expense. And last is tuition tax credits. This framework is a little bit more complicated, and the fact that it's called a tax credit confuses people because who doesn't love a tax credit? But it is just a voucher. So the way it works is a donor will give money to what's commonly called a scholarship granting organization. That SGO then gives money to students to pay for their vouchers to use at a private school. So it looks like a charitable donation, right? Like if say I'm a donor and I give money to an SGO because I want to support someone going to school. But when I file my taxes, I file a tax credit and the state actually gives me money back for my donation. Often it's a dollar for dollar donation. So if I donate $5,000 to that SGO and then I get $5,000 back from the government, I'm not really donating anything. The donor isn't donating anything. It's a transfer of money that would go to the state government instead going to these SGOs. So it's really just a shell game. And what's worse about TTCs is that because you have the intervening SGOs is that the accountability is even worse, that we're seeing that with a lot of ESAs as well that are run by third-party SGOs. But the scholarship organizations have no credibility or no accountability, and there's really no oversight of how that money is getting spent. So why do I define the types of vouchers? Because it's really important to be clear about them, because when vouchers are introduced in state legislatures, if it's an education savings account or it's called a scholarship or whatever term they might use, we're always having to track the new terms that they use. They say it's not a voucher, right? Someone will get up and they will testify and they will say, this is a private school voucher. And they'll say, no, it's an education savings account. It's a tuition tax credit, whatever it is. But at base, these are vouchers. And the reason that they make these changes is because they know when people hear the term vouchers, they oppose them. One of the things I'm sure we'll talk about is the 3 votes that happened this year in states on voucher ballot initiatives, all of which failed because people did a great job of pointing out that those were about vouchers. So it's really important to be clear and solid on the messaging that what these programs are vouchers. So to the second question, there are lots of reasons to oppose vouchers. I'm going to run through some of them. First, public funds should fund public schools. Our public schools are open to all, they're welcoming to all, and 90% of students across the country attend public schools. So they're important to our communities and to making our country really what it is, that free public education. But voucher programs divert money away from public schools to private religious schools, and that undermines public schools because they get less funding. Data of states with statewide programs show that they're primarily funding students who already attend private school or who have never been in public schools. So we're just subsidizing people who can already afford to send their kids to a private school. They don't work. They don't improve academic achievements. Studies of voucher programs across the country show that students perform the same or sometimes even worse than their counterparts in public schools. There is a general lack of accountability across vouchers. So we don't know where that money's going, what curriculum the schools are using. There's no oversight about how these vouchers are used. Students lose rights that they have in private schools. So if you are a student with a disability under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, you have rights in public school. When you go to a private school, you lose those rights. You lose the right to an IEP, to a 504 plan, and lots of, like you lose free speech rights. You use lots of rights that you lose when you go to a private institution. But the important one that I'm going to talk about is they violate religious freedom. So in most states, the majority of voucher funding goes to private religious schools because the majority of private schools in this country are religious. In some states, there are actually programs, voucher programs that where 90% plus of the money goes to private religious schools. And there are some individual voucher programs themselves where 100% of dollars goes to private religious schools. But it's a fundamental principle of religious freedom and church-state separation that the government can't force you to pay for someone else's religious education. And that's exactly what vouchers do. They are taking money from one person and using it to pay for the religious education of another person. That, of course, is the principle that we support at AU, that you should not be forced to pay for someone else's religious education. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has taken a bit of a different view on it, and the case law on vouchers is not on our side. In 2002, in a case called Zellman v. Simmons-Harris, the Supreme Court held that a school voucher program, actually out of Ohio, did not violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution. In that case, Ohio had a voucher program to pay for tuition for students in Cleveland to attend private and private religious schools. Rather than acknowledge the reality that the program was providing public funds to private schools, the court said that they were providing funds to parents who then made an individual choice to use that money at private religious schools, and that gap meant that the program did not violate the First Amendment. I say this as a lawyer. This is why people hate lawyers. Lots of state constitutions also have what are called no-aid clauses. So those are clauses that either say you cannot provide funding to schools that are secular or that are denominational, if you can't provide funding to religious schools, or broadly, you can't provide funding to any religious organization. 48 states have some version of a no-aid clause. But and after Zellman v. Simmons-Harris, we would use no-aid clauses in the states to file lawsuits against voucher programs. But in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court held in Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue that under the First Amendment, if a state creates a private school voucher program, it must fund private religious schools alongside private secular schools. They actually resurrected a program that had been struck down by the Montana State Supreme Court. It was a absolutely ridiculous decision. And then actually now I don't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago, but recently, I think it was 2 years ago, in Carson v. Macon, the court held that when a state provides funding to private schools to provide secular education, it must also provide religious education. So this was a case out of Maine. Maine is a very rural state. So there are actually some areas of the state that don't have public high schools because they are so rural. So they have a program where they will pay for students to go to a private school to get their education, to get their publicly funded education. And there were limits about what type of school that money could be used at. It had to provide a secular education, had to meet certain requirements. And parents who wanted to use that program to go to religious schools sued and unfortunately won. There are still other avenues to be explored in the case law about whether or not schools that receive public funds can discriminate. We know that a lot of private religious schools can and do discriminate. And so if you're using public funding for a program like the one in Maine, but the reality is that unfortunately the court has really cut off a lot of our options. But vouchers are really fundamentally a church-state separation issue because of the idea that you can't force someone to pay for someone else's religious education.
Fascinating, and thank you. And we'll dive deeper on that. And it's terrifying. So hopefully we'll also talk about what we might be able to do about it. Mark, can we drill down now on the state view of this? What is happening in Ohio? Can you give us an overview of what you've seen around vouchers?
Yes. With regard to Ohio, unfortunately, Ohio is an outstanding example of what's wrong with the school voucher program. I'd like to start with a fundamental argument against them that they are a violation of Ohio's own constitution. It is even more specific than the No Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. I know Nick had mentioned what has happened with some of the case law, but I think this is still worth reviewing and making a case for why it's a violation, specifically with what the Ohio Constitution has to say. And it prohibits state funds, school funds, from being used in any way for religious entities that would include the religious schools that are 90% of the Ohio's private schools. That prohibition is, as you see stated here, that's apparently I see being loaded. I'll read it to you. And that is, quote, no religious or other sect shall ever have any exclusive right to or control of any part of the school funds of this state. That's in Article 6, Section 2, Part 2. Now, how have the religious right-wing legislatures tried to work around that? Their deceptive loophole is to say that the money isn't going directly to the religious schools, but to the families who give it to the schools, which we've heard. But that's not credible, knowing how the religious schools are overwhelmingly benefiting from the arrangement, and that billionaire supporters of them who are against the public school system lobbied the Ohio legislatures. The statute is not just in Ohio. It has a historical link to a similarly stated forerunner that was proposed and to be added to the U.S. Constitution in the 1880s. Nick referred to that. He called it the add-on amendment. I think historically or originally it was called the Blaine Amendment because a person named Blaine tried to introduce it. And in Congress, it passed one side of Congress, but not the other. But what happened is that a number of states picked up on it and added to their constitutions, including Ohio. So there are many states, as he mentioned. I think he said 40. I've heard 37. He said 48. So obviously, there's a lot of them that have Blaine or the add-on amendments that are of concern to be defended. Now, there's another very relevant part of the Ohio statute that says, quote, the state of Ohio will secure a thorough and efficient system of common schools, meaning public schools, throughout the state. So the state government is constitutionally responsible for maintaining a viable public school system. With its procedure of taking very large amounts of money from the public school state budget to fund school vouchers, it is not complying with its constitutionally required fiduciary role to provide sufficient support to its public school system. In spite of its apparent unconstitutionality and unchecked problems, the Republican-dominated legislature has continued the drain from the public school budget, as it has exponentially increased tax dollars going to these private schools. Now, as you can see here, it was excessive and irresponsible, and how excessive and irresponsible that is. Started with $8 million in the program in 2008 to almost $1 billion. I think it was 990 something dollars in 2023. It got a huge boost last year with the advent of universal eligibility. Now, a knowledgeable observer said that, quote, the astounding increase was attributed to the uncapped spending on the explosive universal private school voucher program, unquote. And it has been determined that universal eligibility includes the use of the voucher program by wealthy families, students to a large extent who are already attending the private schools. This continuous and huge transfer of finances is a threat to the public schools' operation and stability in Ohio. Next slide, please. When the Ohio legislature enacted a new voucher program as a pilot, this was around 2005, the state budget office wrote in its fiscal analysis, quote, the educational choice scholarships are intended to offer another route for student success, improvement for these students. The Ohio Capitol Journal, a state government and watchdog and reporting agent, produced an article this past year titled, quote, the school voucher illusion, exposing the pretense of equality. Why is the program an illusion and false promise? Here are some specific things that are wrong with it. The new program was supposed to help poor families have an option to choose a different school to improve their child's education. There's no evidence that this is clearly taking place, and there are now many more wealthy families taking advantage of the voucher program than poor families, as we've stated. Beside that, the religious schools are free to reject any of the applicants, essentially discriminating against them, and public schools cannot do that. So access may not really be there for these children. And in a different way, access can be very limited to rural families in Ohio who are not living near private schools that are around Ohio cities. The proposed purpose of the program is generally undermined by owners who have been identified as profiteers and are in the private school business for the money, for promoting Christian nationalism, or both. One more. Now, there is researched evidence that the Ohio voucher program's proposed purpose of improving a student's educational performance has failed. Studies have found that when the academic performance of private school students is compared with the public school students, the results have been consistent with concluding that the private school students' performance is worse than the public school students. I know Nick has referred to this, but I have some very specific things regarding Ohio in regards to that. A Fordham Institute study stated, quote, Ohio students who used vouchers to attend private schools fared worse on exams compared to their closely matched peers remaining in public schools. This same result was cited in an outstanding resource that exactly fits our webinar topic. It's entitled Opposing Private School Vouchers, a Toolkit for Legislatures and Advocates. It was produced in 2023 by the National Coalition for Public Education. It's an evidence-based publication that covers every aspect of our topic. I have a copy of it here. If you can see me again sometime, I'll show it to you because I think it's an extremely valuable document. Regarding the voucher versus public student academic performance, it includes Ohio in this publication among the states about which it reports. And it said this remarkably, the negative effects, quote, the negative effects of Ohio's voucher program on math scores was almost double that of the COVID-19 pandemic's effect on learning loss. That's why I called it remarkable and very specific. And what about the fact that Ohio's quality of education rank has dropped from 10th in 2010 to 28th in 2023? Can it reasonably be questioned if those worse academic performance results and lower educational ranking are associated with the ways that private schools are allowed to operate, with no requirements by the Ohio legislature for setting and adhering to academic standards or being financially accountable? There's been a very glaring and pressing need to correct these failure factors. This year, an attempt to do so was in a bill that was introduced in the Ohio legislature to have private schools account for the money they receive and to test private school students exactly the same as public school students. How about this? It was actually proposed by 2 Republicans who were concerned about how the state's taxpayer money is spent. However, maybe not shockingly, but unfortunately, very recently, on December 2nd, the Ohio Capitol Journal reported that the provisions were removed from that bill and replaced with a substitute version that was passed by the Education Committee that included the elimination of requiring annual reports on funding received by the private schools and a report about their students' families' income and requiring the standardized testing of their students.
Great. Thank you.
That's it. And that's.
And Nick just put in the chat the website for that report, ncpecoalition.org.
Oh, okay.
And cool. We will circle back to you, but I want to bring Beth into the conversation as well, because I already just said, what can we do about it? And you are somebody who's really been doing something about it, which I appreciate. So I'm wondering if you can share with us what your experiences have been fighting voucher programs in Arizona and how the voucher programs there are working to disrupt public education.
Of course. Thanks, Paul. So I've been in this fight about 8 years. Started after the Trump election in 2016, started going down to the Capitol. Just as a teacher and parent, my kids were in preschool. I was teaching 6th grade and couldn't figure out why our schools weren't being funded. And all of a sudden realized that they were trying to pass something called an ESA. And so I and a lot of other educators and parents that had started organizing started to realize what it really was. And we saw that it was this huge threat to public education. And so we, the day that they shoved the voucher bill through the House and Senate, that night, the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, tweeted congratulations to Governor Ducey. And that was the moment where we realized that everything was connected. And, you know, we were late to the game in Arizona. We were all off on our own. We were just parents and teachers doing our thing, started pulling the thread and realizing, oh my gosh, we've been, you know, overtaken by billionaires. This is absolutely insane. This is an existential threat to public schools. And so we organized, we put vouchers on the ballot in 2017. We collected the signatures. Nobody thought we could do it. You know, they kind of patted our heads and said, oh, very cute. Your moms and teachers, this isn't going to happen. But we did. And then we, Arizona voters voted it down in 2018, overwhelmingly rejected it 2-1. And, you know, we thought, okay, well, that felt really good. You know, that seemed like a pretty sizable victory. Maybe we can kind of rest on our laurels a little. No, you know, we had to go right back to the Capitol because they kept trying to pass it piecemeal, break it into smaller expansions. We fought tooth and nail for 3 legislative sessions after that successfully, because we were able to say, like, look, you've got to listen to your voters. And we're talking voters in rural spaces, red spaces, you know, it doesn't matter. Because Arizona voters really do support public schools, and just like most states. And so in 2022, the day after Roe v. Wade was overturned, when everybody was looking the other way, Governor Ducey's very last day of legislative session for his 8th of his 8 years, They shoved it through in the 11th hour. They twisted that final arm. They got the last vote they needed. They threw out all accountability. They had zero transparency, no academic testing, no protections for students, like no anti-discrimination policies, nothing. And that was the moment. And it went through. We tried to fight it, weren't successful. There's so much else going on. And unfortunately, that, our state is now contending with this policy, along with massive tax cuts for the rich. And so currently, it's everything Mark said, it's everything Nick said. But the reality for us on the ground is very visceral because our schools are starting to shut down. Our budget is completely busted. And, we all are here because we care about public schools, but I think it's really important to point out that everybody suffers because there's so much of a new cost to the state for all of these kids that were in homeschool and private school that nobody seems to budget for. Our state certainly doesn't have the funding. And so in this year's budget, they had to slash funding for roads, healthcare, community colleges, universities, water. In Arizona, we had to slash funding for water projects in order to fulfill the dream of not touching this voucher program, which is what the lawmakers insisted upon. So, it's a huge cut to public education, but it's also slashing everything else. I've only got a few minutes, but I will just highlight that we've had a massive proliferation of costs. The program has grown to 83,000 students, which is more than any school district in our state. It is a coupon for the wealthy, like Mark laid out. That's absolutely what's happening. And it's now going to 12% of our state K-12 dollars are going to vouchers instead of to our public schools. So it's really chipping away at our public education system. We have no idea what kids are learning. We've seen anecdotal evidence that parents are buying flat earther curriculum, that they're buying creationist curriculum. We've got Christian nationalist schools that are popping up. There are micro schools, which are just small, unaccredited schools. They're opening up in strip malls, in garages, in people's living rooms with unaccredited teachers. Nobody knows what they're learning. And all of this money is being siphoned away to go to these subpar schools that can turn away whoever they don't want. If you're disabled or you have a 504 plan or you have a different religion or you have a different gender identity or sexual orientation, they don't have to take you. And so it's really not a choice. It's a false choice. It's really the school's choice. So that's the reality here. And the voucher was sold here under the premise that, everybody can have your public school and we can also have vouchers. And that's just not true. That's not living in the land of reality, because we have districts all over the state that are shutting down schools or considering shutting down schools. We've got teacher layoffs. We've got districts that just cut all social workers. They just don't have social workers anymore. And also schools that are shutting down bus routes and going to 4-day school weeks. And so all of those have tremendous impacts, negative, damaging impacts on kids, on educators, on families, on the entire community. And a lot of it is irreversible, and those impacts can hit for decades. So.
And the work of your organization is to advocate and educate. Is that what you're doing?
Yes. And I think, I think it's getting through. I think Arizonans really, really understand this issue and they don't like it. And we have been able to utilize our work, this sort of cautionary tale in Arizona to go to other states. So I presented in Texas, in Tennessee, in Idaho, Montana, all of these other states to say, hey, here's what you're hearing from the people pushing this. Here's the reality on the ground. And I truly believe that's important, because if our whole country falls like a bunch of dominoes, then we lose public education. And we can't allow that to happen because it's too important to our democracy. So.
Thank you. There's so much that was said that I kind of want to pull apart and unpack, including you said the phrase Christian nationalist, which I was going to say if nobody else did. And I think we need to talk about that, because I think we should talk about what are the driving factors, like what do they want to see coming out of this. But it's also really inspiring to me that the beginning we talked about how they're always changing the name, because when it's actually presented to people who can vote on it, it's always voted down. So that there's this obfuscation that then has to happen in order for this minority group of people to override the public will to get their way with things. So I also kind of want to unpack that. But Nick had mentioned to me as an aside that he wanted to just say one thing, which Mark had mentioned, which is the no aid clause Blaine Amendment. Do you want to drill down a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So actually, thank you, Mark, for bringing up the toolkit. NCPE is an organization that Americans United helps run. And so I helped write that toolkit. But on the no aid clause question, so the number, we did a first version of it after the Espinosa decision in 2021. And one of the things that I had to do was go through all the state no aid clauses, and the places I was looking had different counts, and I was like, why are these numbers not the same? Because no one had ever really looked at them all collectively, and there was some overlap, but they were different. So there's no official definition of a no aid clause, so that's why I said some of them are just about education, some of them are more broadly clauses that say you can't provide any funding to a religious organization. But to Mark's point, right? Yes, he makes a correct point about David Blaine, or not David Blaine. Oh my gosh. John Blaine, what is his first name? Whatever. Regardless, the Blaine from the 1800s, not the magician that my brain was thinking of when I said David Blaine. That was part of it. But actually, like the original 13 colonies, those constitutions also have no aid clauses, right? So they predate the Blaine amendments as a thing. And actually, one of the tactics the other side uses is calling them all Blaine amendments derogatorily, because part of what they attribute to that effort was that it was anti-Catholic, that they didn't want to fund Catholic schools, which was part of it. That wasn't not part of it, but it was also more complicated than that. So we make a point of saying no aid clauses and not Blaine amendments, because they are saying Blaine amendments to make them to undermine them. But again, a lot of them were enacted before Blaine was even born, in the 13 original colonies. And also a lot of them have been reaffirmed in years since, right? A lot of states reaffirm or revote on their state constitutions, and many of those state constitutions have reaffirmed their no aid clauses in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, well after Blaine was an issue. So I just wanted to make that point quickly.
Great, thank you. So, if folks have questions, please put it in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I do want to ask a few of my own first, so it gives you some time to think and type. But there was a question already in the chat about funding, which I want to tie into the question I was about to get to around Christian nationalism, because I think it's kind of one and the same of who is funding this. So the question was addressed to you first, Beth, if you want to start on that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this a lot over the years. I think there are different motivations for pushing vouchers, right? You've got the folks that are just there for profit, right? They just see education as an untapped monopoly. Why should all that money go to the government when it can go to private entities? Then you've got folks like DeVos who really feel like, they need to be able to advance God's kingdom. And so they're using vouchers to advance Christian nationalism, among other things. And then you've got a third group that's really just libertarian in nature. They just kind of want to walk away from the government entirely. And that's more your Kochs, your Americans for Prosperity. So I don't know, greed, God, and getting off the grid. There you go.
Wow, that's a lot of Jeeves. I love that alliteration. That we need to
I'm absolutely stealing that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's yours.
Nick and Mark, do you want to add a little bit more? Any other thoughts on this question?
No, from what I know, Beth covered it well.
Yeah, I describe it the exact same way. I hit the same 3 points, but I also saw there's a question about kind of the in-state, out-state question. And so, yeah, there are some states where there are local billionaires, but a lot of the times it's the out-of-state money, right? It's Betsy DeVos, who is in Michigan, donating money. In Kentucky, which voted it down, Jeff Yass, who is in Pennsylvania, I think, donated something like $7 million to a campaign. So it's oftentimes it's out-of-state influence coming in and putting that money in, because it's not the people in the state who are coming up and saying they want this. So it's a lot of out-of-state influence from the exact 3 categories that Beth mentioned.
And just to even go kind of wider on this, because I see a question from Barbara who says, I don't understand what motivates the voucher supporters. Are they not at all concerned about educating children? And I would say they're not. They're like, the word indoctrination gets thrown around a lot from the right toward the left. But what's really happening with religion in America today is, I think, this is my personal opinion, a desire to indoctrinate children. But this has been going on since maybe even the founding of the country. And as far as like, the Skokie monkey trial, I'm not a lawyer, but, we're talking about what are, not just how, but what are we educating our children about? Is the earth billions of years old or 6,000 years old? That's genuinely being taught differently in our school systems in America. And that's, to me, terrifying. So I don't think that the best interest of educating our children is at all what's at play here. And I think a challenge is making the case for public education. And so what I want to do is kind of tie in the Jewish piece of it, which we try to do with this Jews for a Secular Democracy initiative around church-state separation issues. So one of the pillars for us of separation of church and state is LGBTQ equality, for example, because it's being attacked from a religious fundamentalist perspective that most Americans don't share. And there is something like 85 or higher % of US Jews that support gay marriage. This is not a controversial position in the vast majority of the Jewish community. And likewise, with abortion access, which is overwhelmingly supported in the Jewish community. But vouchers, and I haven't seen data on the opinion of this, I feel would not have as strong support in the Jewish community, although maybe I'm wrong because of what, this is news to me that every time it's been offered to the voters, it's been rejected. So maybe it would, but I found that there is perhaps a larger segment than abortion and gay rights who in the Jewish community who would say, what's wrong with me being able to use my taxpayer, like my dollars to send my kid to a Jewish day school, right? There's an ecosystem of Jewish educational schools. What's the answer that we can provide to folks in our own orbit who might say, Jewish education, day school education is hugely expensive everywhere in the US. And I can see why some folks who are educating their kids that way wouldn't mind getting a tax break on it or money from the government and so on. What can we use to convince them that this is ultimately detrimental, not just for the wider, either for the wider society, but also perhaps for their own kids? How would you respond to that? Anyone want to answer that question?
Yeah, I can start.
Okay.
Right. The entire concept behind religious freedom is that, or one of the concepts I mentioned is that you can't force someone to pay for someone else's religion, right? Religious education is what we're focusing on here, but religion in general, because no matter what, there's going to be someone you disagree with eventually, right? Like, and it's not just Jewish versus Christian versus Muslim versus insert religious beliefs here. It's right. Like there are differences between Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews. There are differences between different Christian denominations. There are differences between Catholics and non-Catholic Christians, right? There are long divides there. And right, like once you pay for one, you have to pay for them all. And at some point, you're going to hit someone whose religious beliefs you so firmly disagree with that you would be abhorred to discover that you were paying for it. And actually, I remember well before I even started in this work, it was in Louisiana, I don't know if it was Louisiana or Florida, but there was a state legislator who discovered that vouchers in the state were paying for kids to go to Islamic schools, because once you offer money to any religious, like to use for private schools, you can now have to offer it to all religions. And she was mortified and could not believe that was happening and got all mad about it. And it was like, this is why you don't do this, because you will find a religion you disagree with that you don't want to fund. And if you fund your own religion, you then have to fund all of them. And right, that's why that principle is there, because faith is such a deeply held thing that you don't want to be forced. And right, you shouldn't even be forced to pay for something like, right, even if it's just you are both Baptist, but you go to different Baptist churches and your pastors have different takes on things, right? Like that is the same. It can get as granular as that, but that is why that principle exists. And that's really what it comes down to is, there's going to be someone you disagree with whose religious education you don't want to pay for. And that's why you don't get it, right? Like that's a real thing, but I mean, I guess in terms of preschools, that's a different question. But right, like that's why we have the public education system that is not religious, that is secular, that serves everyone, because everyone can agree that there's no religious perspective is being forced on students that attend there.
Beth or Mark?
Paul, what I thought I was, when you brought up Christian nationalism, can I make a comment about that and how organizations that are Christian nationalists are invading the public school area? And there's two organizations that have done that. People may have heard of them, the Good News Clubs, that are deceitful about what they say they're going to do with the kids, and then they're indoctrinating them and encouraging them to, and these are young kids, very young kids, to bring other kids into it, and they kind of entice them with treats and toys and what have you. But that's after school, but on school grounds. And the other is Lifeway Academy that you guys must know about. It was started in Ohio, and they have, they've convinced the legislatures to allow for them to take the kids off of school grounds and go to a cooperating church in the community, and then really do Bible study with them during the regular public school hours. So that's something that we're aware of, and we recognize, and we're trying to object to. There's a bill in the Ohio legislature right now that is trying to make that mandatory, that the schools have to have a policy about that, where at this time they don't have to have a policy, and so they can cooperate or not cooperate as they see fit. So so we have to be aware of how they're invading the schools, the public schools, in other ways beside what we're just talking about tonight, school vouchers.
Yeah, someone in the chat says that their argument is they shouldn't be forced to pay for public education that they're not using. And that is like the whole breakdown in American society that we're trying to prevent. The kind of standardization of are all different, maybe we already are two different countries or more, but certainly I'm in New York. The Jewish community helped build the New York City public school system for generations, and now there's an open question about, is public education viable anymore? And I find that to be really upsetting and sad, but I do think the cases need to be made stronger.
I take extreme personal offense when people say I'm not using it, so therefore I should get the money, right? Like it's my kids' money. I have 0 kids. I have no children. I have paid taxes. I have been working since I was 15. I've paid taxes for a long time. And I gladly pay into the public school system because I believe in educating children, and I believe it's like a public good, right? It is not their money. It is not their students' money. It is state money that is paying for a public service to provide. And anytime they say that, I just get really angry as someone who has given a lot of tax money over the years to this, because like, I believe in it as a public good, right? I have no kids and I still care about vouchers. I still care about public schools because I went to them and because I have children in my life that I love. Like I care about children that I don't know, and it's not their money, right? That's why we have this system, is like for the betterment of the country, for the betterment of kids. And I wish people got more angry about that argument, that it's like that, right? That it's mine, right? It's not. No, it's a public service that we provide for everyone. That even if you like my grandmother has not had kids in the school system forever. She pays taxes, right? Like that's the thing too. So it's everyone does it all the time. And so that entire concept, I think, is just a little bit offensive to people who don't have kids or who have kids that grew up and are no longer in the school system. That entire concept. And I personally wish that I want people to go out and make that argument angrily more often than perhaps is strategically wise in my professional opinion.
Yeah, and also I'd love to live in a highly educated society, but that doesn't seem to be a compelling argument for certainly the folks who are about to take over the executive branch, who love the uneducated, quote unquote. I mean, I see it as a systematic attack on education, period, because less educated people are easier to manipulate. I'd like to think, I only have a BA, so, but I'd like to think it helps in me being less easily manipulated. So I think that's a piece of the challenge. Beth, did you have you want to weigh in on this?
No, I mean, everything Nick said, I love that he said that I actually care about other people's children. Like, that's exactly how I feel. Like, as a teacher, but even just as a human, yes, I do. Also, I mean, it's just the entitlement is so massive in Arizona. You hear from these parents where, I think people are trying to justify taking this money. And so they say, well, it's my taxpayer dollars. And to Nick's point, no, it's not. No, it's not. The voucher is on average $7,000 per kid. If you've got 5 kids, you're bringing in $35,000. No one in Arizona is paying $35,000 into the state general fund. Like that's not happening unless you're like uber rich. The average household pays like $1,300 into the state general fund, and some families are getting 35,000 back. No, I mean, just not to like put numbers on it. The human impact is more important, but no, it's not yours. And I think taxpayers should be more angry about the fact that their funds are being directed without any choice on their part.
So since I mentioned the income administration, how does this get harder? I mean, Nick kind of touched on the Supreme Court, which seems ready to dismantle public education in America as far as I can see. But, give us, maybe, is there somewhere we can look for optimism? I'm certainly looking at the work that you're all doing around education and advocacy and even legal work to try to stop this. But what can we kind of end on a more optimistic note, or what should we be doing as a group of people who are very concerned?
I can start with the recent ballot success. First of all, anytime vouchers go to the ballot, they get rejected. We know that. But this year, there were ballot measures, so specifically for a tax credit voucher in Nebraska. Advocates there collected signatures like we did to refer it to the ballot. And the legislature went back the next session before the vote and repealed that. And so those advocates had to go back to get signatures and put that new law. They repealed and replaced, put the new law onto the ballot, which, I mean, those people, and I know some of these people, they are just the best humans on earth, and they were fought so hard and they were worried, but Nebraskans rejected it 2-1. Nebraska is an interesting state because it is red, but they love their public schools and they don't have any charters. They don't have any privatization in Nebraska. Then you've got Colorado and Kentucky, which had measures on the ballot, which weren't even direct voucher measures. They were amending the Constitution, certainly in Kentucky, and I think also in Colorado, to sort of usher in the possibility of vouchers. And even so, because the other side said, oh, this isn't a voucher, this is just to give you school choice. And even so, voters in Colorado and Kentucky roundly defeated these vouchers. And I saw data that showed that there were counties in Kentucky that went like 87% to Trump, and they squarely rejected the vouchers. So
what were the arguments? Because we got a question about this coming up in Idaho. What were the arguments that were so compelling for people to make that vote?
I think in all 3 states, one thing that they had in common was they pointed to the fact that rural areas don't have private schools. They don't have those options. And I think that would also work, obviously, in Idaho. And the only options that rural folks do get in this situation are subpar, micro schools and homeschooling, which, can be a draw. But the reality is most people, they're working. They don't have the ability to access that. So that was a huge selling point. And then they looked at states like Arizona and Florida and said, you don't want to do that.
Yeah, the public school messaging is also right, that it undermines public schools is also really important. I always compare, because you do have people who talk about indoctrination in public schools, but I compare it to the weird way that people hate Congress, but like they're congressmen, right? Like people hate, like they hate public schools, but they love their public school because they know their teachers and their principal, right? Even in extremely red areas. And yeah, right, to the point on Kentucky, not only was there that, but every single county in Kentucky voted down vouchers. Every single county in the state. Like it was a truly just phenomenal win. They did an amazing job there. And the other really big lesson that I've heard the people in Kentucky say is it's about the messenger, right? Like the pro voucher side has so much money, which is difficult to overcome, but they were very specific about the messengers. It was people in the state. I'm here doing this work, and one of the things I always come in and say is like, if I don't, right, tell me what message if you want me to say something, great. If you don't, I won't, because I understand that we're an out-of-state organization. Our name can be controversial. There's all these different reasons that we might not be helpful, but it's about finding the right messenger. So it was parents, it was teachers, right? Getting them out there, because the other side comes in and they bring in parents and they have kids with extremely sympathetic stories. Like I'm, not discounting any single parent who wants the best for their kid. I understand that. But they will take in people who have these really sympathetic stories and say, oh, my kid is in a bad school, blah, blah, blah. I don't know why the answer isn't fix the public schools instead of just give them a voucher, but they have that and they're not hearing enough from the other side. So when our side gets out there and says, I'm a parent of a public, like I have kids in public schools and I care about this. I'm a teacher and I care about this, because public schools don't just educate kids. A lot of times, especially in rural communities, they're the lifeblood of the community. They're a gathering center. We go to football games, depending, that's a big thing in Texas. They've actually already started that whole thing of Governor Abbott's going to end Friday night lights, right? When you undermine your public schools, where do people go on Fridays to watch games? They're a big employer in a lot of small rural towns. And so really just honing on the message that's going to work for individual people, but having the right messengers as well. So, if you're on this call, you care about those things, finding the group that's organizing in your state and getting involved to make sure that this doesn't happen, or if there's a ballot initiative to have it vote in your favor.
You want to add in, Mark?
Oh, I took a look at this and what happened with in the 3 states, and most of the information I've got, they've covered it extremely well. So I was looking to see if there was one other point I had, but no, they got it.
And we're coming to a close, and I hesitate to open up something that we could probably just do a whole other webinar on, but I would feel remiss if I didn't also bring up this question, and I don't know for sure if this is the case or not, but having done a kind of deep dive on Christian nationalism through this work, and often calling it white Christian nationalism, and understanding that the history of it started not with Roe v. Wade, but with desegregation in the South and the forced integration of public schools, which is where many people who are experts trace the beginning of the current wave of white Christian nationalism. What's the racial component behind wanting vouchers in these communities? Is there one? Do you see that? Is this a way for white parents to get out of sending their kids or supporting public schools of diversity?
Certainly in Arizona, we can see, we don't have demographic data, but the state doesn't collect it because apparently they want vouchers to be a black box. But they do collect zip code data. And so they've been able, researchers have modeled, and they show that most vouchers are being utilized in white suburbs, predominantly affluent families. Yeah, I mean, a lot of parents, they don't say the quiet part out loud. It's very much of a feeling of, I don't want my kids to go to school with those kids. And it's real.
Yeah.
It's definitely white flight.
Paul?
Yeah.
Can I add something real quick? But it has to do with what can be done about this. Now, in Ohio, and I've become very familiar with this, there is a coalition of school districts across the state. It's over 140 of them that formed a coalition, and they actually, last couple of years, it has taken some time to get through this, sued the state of Ohio about this. It's a lawsuit that they brought to bear, and it's going to be reviewed, I think, in January. It's going to court in January, and we've even got involved encouraging our local school districts, the school boards, to join the coalition if they haven't already. So that's an important thing. And also there's a coalition of it's the staff that work in the schools that I think are formulating their position and how they're going to support this kind of thing too. So when we get concerned, what can be done about this? You've got these groups that have, I think, legitimate value, legitimate vested interest in what's happening, and can take action, and then eventually get enough support where they can get it on the Ohio ballot that we've seen that was done in the other 3 states.
So I'm kind of seeing a commonality or theme, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the legal paths, if the Supreme Court is gonna reject what seems rational to so many of us, is more about going directly to the voters. Would you say that that's the path forward, or is it a mix? Nick, I know you guys do a lot of legal work.
Yeah. Since the Espinoza case, we don't do many voucher lawsuits anymore. We used to do a lot of them under the state no aid clauses. But I will say, right, I mean, unfortunately, not every state allows for ballot initiatives, whether like sometimes they have to be legislatively referred. Some states have no ballot initiative options at all. So it's not an option in every state. But as we have learned with the Supreme Court, precedent doesn't matter. So what is the law today may not be the law in the future. So part of the optimism is, one day there will be a new Supreme Court that might take a different view of things. But I think you have to do both, right? You have to protect the programs that you have when you can, if you can get on a ballot initiative, or just stopping the bills. Like, it's so often for us, it's about stopping bills before they can get enacted, because they're very hard to undo once they are entrenched. Although I will say, Illinois this year or last year, Illinois let a voucher program expire, and so they are the first state that I'm aware of that had a voucher program that has now gone away. But yeah, you also have to keep doing the lawsuits, right? And like we're thinking about ways. Sorry about that. We're thinking about ways that we can do that. Like I said, the idea of if it's for a Maine-like situation and they're providing funding to a school that discriminates, can they put non-discrimination protections on a voucher program? And we know that those, if any sort of non-discrimination provisions, will be challenged eventually, because religious schools want to violate them, especially around LGBTQ students or families. But continuing to make sure we're trying to stop that from happening.
And there is a good comment there were many great questions and comments in the chat. So thank you everybody for contributing. Lee talked about attending local school board meetings, right? Just getting involved at the most local level, because that was a strategy on the right for a long time. And I think the left didn't get there. And we're only now is starting to recognize that all politics is local, but even really local. And I really appreciate all that you had to say today. I know that there's so much more, but you all do such important work. And I hope that folks got something out of it. The comments I'm already seeing are very positive. And we will follow your work, and we want to help in other ways that we can. If there's something that folks can do, I know we've shared your various organizations and websites, but any last thoughts before we close?
No, just appreciate that you organized this. Katie did such a great job with that.
Sometimes Katie gets camera shy, but Katie Ryder is our national director.
She did such an excellent job keeping us informed and organizing it. It was great. So we appreciate you sponsoring or managing this and inviting the organization to co-sponsor it.
Thank you. Yes, reach out to Katie. info@jfasd.org is her email address. And please, folks, get involved in as many ways as you can. So thank you so much to our panelists for being here. Really appreciate it. And we will continue this conversation because it's so important. So thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.